Good morning. Perhaps I'm in a nostalgic mood this morning on this Wednesday. Not really sure why, but I was thinking so much that 1985 is 40 years ago. To put that into perspective, for somebody in 1985, that would be like looking at 1945, which seems a lot farther back than 1985 does now. I guess it's a matter of your age and your perspective. But I'm curious, if you could take yourself now, go back and live for a week in 1985, find a DeLorean, fire up the flux capacitor, and go back to 1985. Be your same physical self that you were in 1985. So, if you were in high school or college age or whatever, you'd be yourself at that time. Everybody else would be in that time, but you would know what you know now in 2025. So imagine going back to a time with um, no internet, no cell phones. Well, cell phones existed, but they were extremely rare at that point. But no internet, no social media, no cell phones, no, video cameras were still pretty rare. Usually they were those big, huge things that look like a TV camera. But go back and live for a week in that time period. But you, the conditions are that you couldn't tell anybody about any future events, or that you were really living 40 years from now. And the other condition is that what happens in 1985 stays in 1985. And I got to thinking, you know, it opens up a whole can of worms, the old time space continuum and whatnot. And if you did something back then, you know, would it automatically affect the future? I don't know. I don't want to get too much into that. But I think back, what would be the first thing I would do? I'd probably try and find a an IROC Z Camaro, which I think they came out in the summer of '85, spring of '85. Find a an IROC Z Camaro or a Mustang GT. Get some Bon Jovi, Bruce Springsteen, Van Halen, and Def Leppard cassette tapes. Turn up the music, drive around. I would head to an old restaurant, used to exist a long time ago in Pennsylvania. It was called Luigi's, and you could get for about $7. You could get a stromboli the size of a football, and they deep fried it. I have never had anything like that in my life. It's long out of business. The owner died, and then his son took it over, and I think he passed away too. And one of the granddaughters opened up a different restaurant in another part of town, and it's no longer there. But anyway, I went back up about 20 years to go to visit some college friends, and I basically had a another deep fried stromboli, and I was like sweating Crisco out of my pores. I couldn't eat that stuff today; it'd give you a heart attack. But I would head to there and maybe get some a cheap case of ice cold beer, go get some VHS movies, get together with some friends, and we used to go cruising a lot. But a big thing that people used to do back then, if you had somebody who had a decent sized property, you'd have a bonfire in the backyard. And it was weird. The only social media we had was somebody who had a CB radio. But you would have a bunch of impromptu friends. People just sort of knew where to go when something was going on. Word got out, and you have a big bonfire in the backyard, and people just stand around. And especially in the cooler months, it was kind of nice. You could stay warm. I guess people don't really do that stuff anymore. But I was thinking back when we were in our teenage years, maybe in our early 20s. We didn't know that it would happen, but there was one night, one evening, we went out to play with our friends, ride our bikes, go out, and it would be for the last time. We went to a bonfire for the last time. We went cruising for the last time. We went to the mall with our friends for the last time. And at the time, we never knew it, but things just got, life moved on. People, you got out of school, you moved away, you met a significant other, you got married, you had children, you got a dog, you got a house or whatnot. You were too busy working. And all of a sudden, 20 became 30, and then 30 became 40, 40 became 50. And now for many of us, 50 is becoming 60. And, we're grandparents now, and it doesn't seem that long ago. You think in your mind of like, oh, the 1990s, oh, that was like 10 years ago. But so much has happened since then. But I was just in one of those weird moods. I guess I watched a couple videos. I saw some things on TV, and it's fun to watch all these old shows, especially for the cars and the clothing and the hairstyles. And, the women had, all had big hair back then. And many of the I never did it, but many of the guys had mullets. Um, you look at some of the clothing, the parachute pants, and um, everybody wanted to have a Pontiac Trans Am with a big screaming chicken on the hood. And the 1980s was an interesting decade, at least for the point of music. Oh man, there was some good music in the 80s. And MTV when they played videos. But yeah, I was just thinking about it. The 80s. I was born in '65, so I grew up in that era. But I remember having, despite things seeming kind of crazy, and for a lot of the 80s, I didn't have a pot to piss in, but I had this sense of eternal optimism. It was like, well, if you stay in school and you don't do drugs and you don't engage in criminal behavior, you're guaranteed to be successful. That was always the way it was. Even when I was, working in a grocery store or bagging groceries or, unloading trucks or whatever, making really low wages. Of course, money went farther back then, but, I always just thought, well, things are always going to get better. And now that I'm actually financially better off than I was in the 80s, of course, but I still don't have that same sense of optimism for the whole country that I did back then. It's just kind of an interesting way. You think about how fast the time went and everything, and you look at kids growing up today. I'm really Gen X, but we were the last generation to actually experience all that. I know the millennials and Gen Z have their things they grew up with that we didn't have, but it's just kind of interesting that we were the last ones that, our parents really didn't. We would disappear on our bicycles. They really didn't know where we were. There was no cell phones. They couldn't keep in touch with us. You found out where everybody went by looking at the bicycles in the yard. But yeah, time just gets away from you. And, the older I get, the faster time seems to go. When I was, a teenager, it seemed like 2 weeks from now was an eternity. Now it's like we plan something 6 months from now and bam, it gets here really fast. And my grandson is already 5 months old now. And it just seems like he just came into the world not long ago. So it's like, I guess as we have less sand in the top of our hourglass than we do in the bottom, we tend to, wax nostalgic about things. And of course, I know that in the past, not everything was great. The Billy Joel song, I think it's called Keeping the Faith, kind of reminds me. There's a line in it where he says, the good old days weren't always so good, and today ain't as bad as it seems. But, throughout history, we do tend to look back on the good old days, but we sort of push aside the bad things that happen. We kind of push that out of our memory and focus only on the good things. Of course, not everything was perfect. We had issues just as we do today, but you think back, I would love to spend a week back in 1985. It'd be weird without having your cell phone and social media and all that, but man, those were some fun times. I think back, in 1985, I was at college. I was working part-time at a grocery store, and I was living in a fraternity house, and the rent was like $88 a month or something like that. And I mean, it was a dive, but going into the store and buying generic corn chips and I didn't get SpaghettiOs, I got spaghetti hoops. you know, man, you learn how to live cheap. But I'll tell you what, I wouldn't trade some of those memories for the world. I mean, when you were getting, I think it was the name, it was Buckhorn. The beer was like $1.99 for a 6 pack, and everybody said it was made out of deer piss. But you know what? When it was cold, it still tasted pretty damn good. A lot of that stuff that was cheap swill, that you would look at as cheap swill today, it tasted pretty good when you were a college student. Um, but yeah, that Luigi Stromboli from college, that little dive place right off campus, and it was like, damn thing was almost as big as a football, and it was like $7, and you could pretty much get like, I used to get it with like ham, pepperoni, and either onions or green peppers in it. And it was so good. And they had a steak stromboli that was a little bit more expensive, but I didn't really care for the steak stromboli as much. I like the cheaper one, but they would take the damn thing and they would deep fry it. I've never seen a deep fried stromboli, but man, you could feel your arteries hardening when you ate that thing. But when you were 19, 20 years old, who cared? You could eat like that and stay skinny and never gain weight. Wow, times have changed in that regard. I'd love to be able to go back to 1985 just to be able to eat like that again. A triple baconator at Wendy's, no big deal. But anyway, I was just waxing nostalgic about that, no big deal. But I just wondered, would you go back 40 years ago and live for a week, sort of incognito? I mean, you probably wouldn't want to live, you wouldn't want to go somewhere where everybody might know you, or you could run into yourself. That'd be a scary thing, and brings up another question. If you could meet yourself from 40 years ago, what would you tell them? What would you tell him or her? Interesting question. Anyway, that's a lot about nothing. That just was on my mind today. I hope everybody has a good Wednesday.